in St. Louis. After the shock, and believe me, I was really thrown for a loop upon hearing of Jim's death, and subsequently perusing some of the many articles that appeared, I found myself doing a bit of math. Jim was 74 at the time of his death, which meant that when first meeting him in 1969, when I was 18, he was a 30-year-old rabbi with 3 little kids. My early recollection of you, Eitan, bye guys, thanks for coming. My early recollections of you, Eitan, you were about a year old, in diapers, happily cuddling with your Ima, who was always at Jim's side as Rebbitzin. Jim, at that time, had already served several years in a pulpit in White Plains, New York, and I will spare you the superlatives that he occasionally uttered in language most unbecoming to him, describing that experience, and the vision he had from that pulpit, which prompted him to leave that position and enter Hillel work. Hamavim Yavi. I remember the Diamonds offering me a ride home as they headed for Chicago. Jim, Judy, me, and the kids, during which time little Gila, who at that point didn't talk to anyone, and I became great pals. This small man established himself as a true giant among students whose lives he touched and colleagues privileged to work with him. A giant because of his extreme modesty, tolerance, sensitivity, intellect, and passion not just for Judaism, and acceptance and tolerance in nurturing Jewish students of every persuasion, even those of little persuasion at all. He not only loved Judaism, but he loved Jews of all shapes, sizes, inclinations, and so forth. He knew how to talk to everyone, making them feel as if he was focusing only on them. He respected everyone and in turn truly earned the respect and high regard of generations of students and colleagues, some of whom are here with us this evening. The late 60s, for those of you who might remember, or if you're too young, you might have heard about it, was rather a turbulent time on U.S. college campuses. And that year of 1969-70 saw the disenfranchisement of many radical Jewish student leaders involved in organizations such as SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. Jim was a true pillar of support to those students who suddenly experienced a rift between their radical political commitment and their deep Jewish and Zionist commitment. He embraced and welcomed them, in some cases nurturing their energy and leadership to shift focus toward the radical Jewish and Zionist student organizations that were blossoming post-1967. He encouraged and enabled students of all streams to participate in prayer, study, and cultural activities, offering ample opportunities for all to lead and create. I guess he had to exert a bit of moderate control at times over some of the Meshuggahs, those inspired and not infrequently rather wacky, budding young leadership. It was the 60s, a lot of them were drugged out, but they were welcome and they were embraced. There always seemed to be a welcoming place for student-led, rabbi-supported minyanim, seders, and celebrations for all. I remember a childhood friend losing his own father while we were undergrads at Indiana, and how Jim supported him and made it easier for this fraternity boy to faithfully recite Kaddish at the Hillel House throughout his year of mourning. I am in contact with that man until today, and know that he has never forgotten Jim's tender support. I only hope that we, who so loved and valued Jim, can provide even a small measure of empathy to Eitan and his family as we cope with our own profound sense of loss. When Jim and Judy visited Israel several years ago, celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary by bringing their children and grandchildren, we were their guests at a very informal and fun Shabbat dinner, where I think your dad was wearing his bar mitzvah kippah, if I'm not mistaken. Did it say Jimmy's bar mitzvah? This dinner was in the vacation apartment I helped them locate for their stay. I asked the now middle-aged children, who I hadn't seen in years, the middle-aged children of that young Rabbi Diamond, if they had any recollection at all of me as a student in Bloomington, or later as Jim's associate at Hillel in St. Louis. Because in my mind, there was seldom a Shabbat or holiday that I wasn't a guest at your parents' table. Obviously, generations of students come and go, but our special relationship was recognized by both the Diamond and the Hendon children. Jim was skillful, or perhaps it was actually National Hillel Speakers Bureau, in bringing big-name speakers to campus. And again, I must have been a VPS, a very privileged student. Invited to dine with the Diamonds as they hosted the likes of Isaac Basheva's singer. It's not a fantasy. He was there, I was there, you were there. Reb Shlomo Carlebach, and a plethora of other Jewish giants of the time. No less interesting and fun were the invitations for holiday meals when your grandmothers were visiting, when either Jim or Judy's mothers visiting from Canada, packing up your dad's favorite foods that they had made and brought, would be the guests of honor. Those were wonderful memories. Ron, who's not here tonight because he's visiting his own mom in St. Louis, asked me to speak on his behalf as well. When Ron and I took leave of Bloomington during the 1971-72 academic year to study at Hebrew University here in Jerusalem, Jim was recruited to assume the directorship of Hillel at Washington University in St. Louis, which also served a number of other small local campuses. When we returned from Israel for our senior year in Indiana, our much-loved rabbi wasn't there to welcome us back. But nonetheless, we continued to be active and involved in Jewish student life. I even found myself working part-time at Hillel during my final semester, having accumulated so much Hebrew credit from the Hebrew U Ulpan that I had a light course load. You're asking yourself, why isn't her Hebrew any better today? But that remains to be discussed. As I contemplated my next steps, I had the opportunity to enroll in a graduate program at the Hebrew Union College, then School of Jewish Communal Service in LA, now called Nonprofit Management. Jim turned to me and asked me to consider joining him in St. Louis as his program associate, having nixed the idea for the time being of a second rabbi. Women and non-rabbinic personnel were just coming onto the scene in Hillel in the early 70s. Obviously, I was honored and overjoyed at the opportunity to work with Jim and have him mentor me, which he truly did in great style. Introducing me to the young Rabbi Larry Maurer, his new friend and much-loved associate at the University of Missouri Hillel in Columbia, another Jim-enabled friendship and colleague with whom I've had the pleasure of associating for many years here in Jerusalem, from the Midwest to the Mideast. That autumn of 1973, I began work with Jim in St. Louis. Again, the fall semester barely got off the ground and high holidays were upon us. This time, we were harshly distracted from concluding our Yom Kippur Ne'ilah service and breakfast by news of the ensuing battles in Israel that soon came to be known as the Yom Kippur War. Hillel immediately became the clearinghouse for those wishing to go to Israel as volunteers. Ron was among the first to leave in that group. On his return some 6 months later, we decided to marry and make Aliyah. Jim, hearing of our plans and knowing we would want him to officiate at our wedding, made it very clear that even though he knew us so well, it was essential that we meet with him and Judy in their home after the children were asleep. Schiffer was probably upstairs reading Dr. Spock with a flashlight. This was Jim's requirement before proceeding any further with our plans. His premarital counseling went something like this. Every day should be a honeymoon. That's how it is with me and Judy. You need to seriously ask yourselves where you will be as a couple for one another. A year from now, a year after the wedding, 5 years after, 10 years after, and hopefully much more. What wise and valuable counseling. Another student from the early days at IU, who's sitting with us tonight, and who I had the privilege of reconnecting with recently, who Jim also officiated at her wedding, recently recalled, as we remember Jim together, how before the cell phone era, she was with Jim when he frantically had to reach Judy and called the place where he thought she might be. They said, well, who are you looking for? Can you describe her? And according to Terry, he hesitated and said, well, she's very beautiful. Very typical. This from a rabbinic couple whose lives were exemplary to their students. A loving, strong marriage, a warm, nurturing home, ever open for hachnasat orchim, devotion to children, to their own parents, to their community, a pursuit of academic interests, and a true joy of life. Jim's relationship with Israel over the years was often complicated, as he would readily admit. Sort of like regarding Israel as a great product, but with some side effects. He viewed Ron and I as a sort of last of the non-Orthodox ideological Zionist domain, and never throughout all of the years visited Israel without spending time with us. Shortly after our own Aliyah, he had the opportunity to bring a student group for a college break program to Israel, and asked me to be their local sort of madricha. I took time off work to do so, and once again had the pleasure and fun of working with Jim. Less than 2 short months ago, during what now has become Jim and Judy's annual long-term visit with Eitan and his family and time in Jerusalem, we found ourselves sitting together at Kabbalat Shabbat at Kol HaNeshama, and suddenly realized we were surrounded by other random characters from those good old days, both in Indiana and St. Louis, many of whom have made their permanent homes in Israel, others who are visiting. We all realized that that was a very special moment of reminiscence that can only happen in Jerusalem. Having spent much more time with Judy than Jim during this most recent visit, as Judy volunteered here at Milabev, it was weird not to be spending more time with Jim. I suggested that the 4 of us make time to take a table together before they left, and we actually did that. We planned an overnight car trip to the south to witness what I knew were the wondrous miracles of winter agriculture in the Arava and the very special and unique communities there. We had a wonderful time, the 4 of us. They loved all that they saw, the people who they met and hosted. We had quality time together, and we recognized that as being very, very special. They rated this Teal and Judy's volunteer work at Milabev as among the highlights of their recent visit. Little did we dream that only a few short weeks later Jim would be tragically taken from us, and that this time together would have been our last. We take some comfort in recalling that wonderful Teal. In conclusion, I would like to share with you some obvious and less known facts about Jim Diamond. Distinguishing characteristics: small man, giant mensch. Gentle laugh, terrific sense of humor. Alcohol history. Kids, are you listening to this? You haven't heard about this. Upon hearing of Jim's death, a friend from the old days said, "Wasn't that the guy who translated the Budweiser beer can label into Hebrew when Bud was first marketed in Israel? He did that with great pride and told everyone about it." Again, Midwest to Mideast. Your grandpa kept a bottle of Southern Comfort bourbon, rather uncharacteristic for a Canadian, in the bottom right-hand drawer of every desk he ever had in any location that he served. This was to be extracted for shared consumption during highly unusual situations. His culinary preferences included trying to plan his visits to Israel in the winter when Krembo was in season, before discovering marzipan rugelach. Jim will be remembered for significantly touching and impacting on the personal and professional lives of several generations, having inspired and developed tons of emergent leadership. He is and will continue to be sorely missed. The world is a better place for him having passed through. Yehi zichro baruch.
since learning of his death, and I think that I've probably stopped looking at the emails the last thing before going to bed. Since learning of his death, there have been a few hours that have passed without my wincing at the thought that Jim is no longer able to actively teach us. He was one of those people whose presence in the world was reassuring because you knew that you could call him at any time and get an honest answer in relatively few words to the most pressing or urgent questions that you had. And his absence means that that's no longer available. I wince at the thought that his life was ended by a grotesque convergence of illness, accident, and disregard for life. I'm still trying to find comfort in his last visit in our home, so long delayed, and now impossibly the last time I shall find so much pleasure in his company. I don't have the words adequate to commemorate all that he so generously gave me, to convey in this halting fashion the impact he had and the meaning that he brought to my work and some of my efforts. He was my very first Hillel friend and colleague. He was wonderfully, generously empowering as he related to me as a chaver, though I was far more truly his student. He was able to accept my and many others' severe limitations of knowledge and experience with genuine concern, without disparagement, and he encouraged our getting beyond them. Even better, he helped us design a way to lessen their hold on our thinking. As we try to learn much more, act with greater and deeper Jewish authenticity. Had he even been a little less kind, less sensitive, less encouraging, I think we would have been daunted as his colleagues. But then he was almost never less kind or less sensitive. He spoke, I think taught is a better description, at Amilas Simchat Bat, schlepped from St. Louis, not only